here's part 3, the last part. So now we're talking about the cell-mediated response. So again, if we look at my image here, we've got here our B cells, our humoral response, and then here we have our T cells, our cell-mediated response. So this is what we're going to look at now, the cell-mediated response related to T cells. So again, figure 35.16 on page 723 is really helpful for sort of understanding what I'm looking at, what I'm going through. And if you look here at this image that I'm circling with my cursor, that sort of draws your attention to the figure I'm talking about. Okay, so this has to do with T cells. And specifically, we're talking about cytotoxic T cells and memory T cells. So remember, we have phagocytes, and they present antigens to helper T cells, and the helper T cells are then activated, and they activate specific T cells. So if we look at this figure, 35.16, we've got our pathogen. It has the antigens. They go inside of a phagocyte, which presents the antigens and says, hey, this is the name tag for the bad guy. And then the helper T cells goes, okay, now I know who the bad guy is. I'm going to activate my folks. And those are the B cells for the humoral response and the T cells for the cell-mediated response. So now we're talking about that cell-mediated response. So we got our cytotoxic T cells and our memory cells. So the cytotoxic T cells, I think of them sort of as killers. They're like the assassins. They're the ones that hunt down the very specific cell that has the problem, and they make that cell die. We'll talk about that more specifically in a second. The memory T cells are more like memory B cells. They stick around, they know what to do. Basically, they're there to prepare in case of a future infection, because if there is a future infection of that exact same thing, then they can, boom, activate really fast. So the receptor that the T cells are using is similar to the B cell receptor in that it's looking for a specific antigen, right? So again, this is the specific immune response, which means it's for one specific antigen, not just anyone, right? And the way that works, it's interacting with a cell, for example, a phagocyte that has ingested the pathogen. So if we look here it now breaks it down, and it's got these little antigens, those little name tags, and it goes, hey, here's the name tag. The way it holds out that name tag is this MHC molecule, the major histocompatibility complex, and that's how it holds out that antigen. And then a T cell comes along, and it's got its little receptor, which is kind of like the B cell receptor, sort of like the thing that's on antibodies, but not really the same, and it binds. And so then, now we've got our cytotoxic T cell that has bound with that antigen, and so what is it going to do? So it can bind with the antigen of that's being presented on an infected cell. So this is different than a phagocyte. So in this case here, we have the major histocompatibility complex holding out the antigen, but in this case, instead of saying, hey, you should look for this guy, it's saying, hey, this guy is inside of me. I am having a problem, come and help me. It's like an SOS signal. And so the T cell comes along. This is a cytotoxic T cell. Remember, cytotoxic T cells are those killer T cells. That's how I think of them, as the killers or the assassins. So the killer T cell comes along. It binds with that antigen receptor, with the major histocompatibility complex, and it begins the process of killing this infected cell. So it says, oh, you've got a problem, we're going to destroy you, so we destroy the pathogen with you. Okay, so that's what cytotoxic T cells do. Again, they're assassins hunting down specific problems, right? A specific pathogen and killing it. Before we move on, I just wanted to make really clear what memory T cells are. So again, here's my image. This is what I would have on the whiteboard again, right? So we've now completed the whole thing. We had our helper T cells activate our T cells as well as our B cells, and then our T cells have our cell-mediated response, which produces cytotoxic T cells to hunt and kill down the cells that have been infected by the pathogen. And then we've also got our memory T cells. The memory T cells are around in case there's a future infection, because if there is, then the memory T cells can produce cytotoxic T cells really able to produce plasma B cells really fast. Okay, so examples of what have allergies, which is sort of like what Justine and Anthony talked about with their project, with their presentation on nut allergies. So what is going on here is your inflammatory response, right, which is part of your non-specific immune system, acts up even though there's nothing bad going on. So basically, the person eats some sort of peanut, let's say, for example, or whatever the allergy causing factor may be. And that person, then their immune system gets very hyped up, and there's a lot of histamines released, and basically it leads to that whole inflammatory response, the swelling, the redness, the blood rushing to that spot, all the pathogen that has entered the system. So that's an allergy in just super simplistic terms. Autoimmune diseases we talked about in class today, the Friday before break, but basically autoimmune diseases, the idea here is the immune system is not able to do that really crucial thing of tell self from non-self and attacks self, even though obviously there's no reason to attack self. So that's an autoimmune disease. And as I was saying in class, the treatment is often a drug that can actually suppress the immune system, sort of like chemotherapy drugs. So those can be used as well for autoimmune diseases, but obviously there are some very negative side effects to chemotherapy drugs. Okay, and then next, and finally, AIDS. So the HIV virus actually infects helper T cells. So if you remember here, our image, right, helper T cells begin the entire part of the specific response. So if you have helper T cells down, then you don't get any of this. So that's a huge problem. And what that ends up meaning is that people who are infected with HIV are their whole immune system is compromised. And so they're at the will of opportunistic infections. So basically, something that would not normally hurt someone very bad or someone would get over really easily, like the common cold, for someone who has HIV can be incredibly detrimental because their body doesn't have a way to respond to that. So AIDS is very, and then AIDS is actually the whole host of symptoms that happens after someone has been infected with HIV. HIV is the virus, AIDS is the condition. And one other thing that goes along with HIV is that HIV actually mutates incredibly fast. So the antigen that it presents is constantly changing because it's mutating so often. The virus. And so your body, even if it were able to figure out, or also with drugs, even if they were able to figure out, okay, this is the antigen to look out for, this is how we're going to attack the virus, because it's changing so often and because the whole specific immune response is based on that specific puzzle piece effect, right? It has a very difficult time doing that because it's constantly changing. It's basically constantly going into disguise. And then last thing I'm going to talk about in this lecture is vaccination. So this is what Brianna talked about in her presentation a few days ago. So remember, she talked about how Edward Jenner developed the vaccine for smallpox. So this was the invention of vaccination. And this all has to do with this idea that we looked at right here. So again, this figure, very important. So vaccinations, basically how they work is they expose you to, in today's terms, usually a killed portion of the virus. So you have a virus and we kill it and then we expose you to it. And your body develops antibodies to it and you don't get sick because it's killed, so it doesn't harm you, and you develop antibodies to it. Then next time you're exposed to it, this time you're exposed to the real thing, and you've already got those antibodies. They get produced so fast, you don't even get sick, and so you don't know. So you got the flu shot, and you might have been exposed to the flu, but you never even knew it because your body produced the antibodies so fast. the way it worked in Edward Jenner's was, right, people were exposed to cowpox, so they produced antibodies to cowpox, and they did get sick, but it wasn't so bad. They got some sores, but they didn't die like they would have if they got smallpox. And then when they were exposed to smallpox, because it also could be harmed by this, or because the antibodies for cowpox actually worked just fine for smallpox, for your immune system protecting itself against smallpox, then when the body produced a massive amount of the antibodies to cowpox in response to getting smallpox, the person was fine and didn't get sick. So that's how vaccines work. And that is the end of this lecture. So I hope you enjoyed and I hope you have a very wonderful Thanksgiving break, and I will see you when we get back. Thank you.